So in 2015, Ada Colau was the first woman to ever be elected mayor of Barcelona. Surveys in Barcelona have shown that women use public transit, biking, and walking to get around the city, while men tend to drive more. Prior to Ada, much of Barcelona's mobility investment was focused on cars. Since her election, more resources have been put into transit, biking, and walkability. For some of you city nerds out there, you can see the image on the right, and that's that's Superblock, and it's a strategy that she has put forward in order to build more walkable, more bikeable cities in which you can get what you need within a 15-minute walk. So my question to you then is there a government outside, a municipal government outside of Barcelona that you think does a good job at understanding how women use infrastructure? And if not, how can governments do a better job at building infrastructure that better serves the needs of women? And we'll start off with Lorelei.
I'm going to give a two-part answer. So one will be the direct, in terms of actual like physical. I
think Lorelei is frozen. Give it 1 minute. Sure, it'll clear up. Well, let's wait until Lorelei's good. Her connection will clear up, but maybe we can move on to, oh, Lorelei. Okay, you froze there for a sec.
Oh, I was just stalling for an answer. So what I was saying.
Yeah.
I got some more time there. What I was saying, and it's just that I'm always partial to countries like Denmark and to Sweden and to Finland. I've worked in Finland particularly, and I find that there's like a way of getting around the city that seems easier. There's a lot more options, very bike centric, especially in Copenhagen in particular. There's a reason they rate #1 on the happiness index. So I would say I'm partial to that. But in terms of not just, if I think beyond the physical infrastructure, I know this isn't really the question, but what I'm interested in too is the social infrastructure. So how people combine that physical infrastructure into social infrastructure. And we won't have time to really go into the example, but I encourage everybody to look at the Philippines, which isn't a case study that often in terms of social infrastructure. They're well known for their strong family units typically, but I had the chance to work in a region called Paquibato. And there's been a peace process underway. And in 40 years of violence, it took a female mayor and a woman leading a committee through City Hall. She was the peace advisor to the mayor to actually bring out peace in the region after 40 years. And what they did, and this is we won't get into it, but in terms of social infrastructure, they asked the people what they were worried about. And no one had asked the people, like, what's actually going on socially for you? There's lots of ways to get around, but what's going on socially? So they asked people and they said, we're afraid of violence and we don't have access to food. So the women got together and they created a bunch of different ways to get food into schools. They did training on growing vegetables and vegetable gardens. And this was in 2018. In 2019, they celebrated an entire year without violence. And the end result was that they established like a hotline for people who wanted to call in around what they were feeling, what they needed through the social infrastructure. And from that, the rebels started calling in from the violent movement, and 92 rebels ended up surrendering. And so anyway, that is an interesting parallel for me in terms of what's important about sort of that built environment and what's important about the social environment. And when I saw that question, I thought, how women would think differently potentially in that scenario. And it was a female mayor and Irene Santiago, peace leader, who actually came up with, what if we asked people what they were worried about? So I just wanted to layer that into the conversation as part of what might be important to consider in terms of other types of infrastructure.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that story. That was really powerful. So I will adapt this question to include social infrastructure. So next up, we'll go to Rachel. And So is there a government outside of Barcelona that you think does a good job at understanding how women use social and physical infrastructure? And if not, how do you think governments can do a better job at better understanding the needs of women?
Obviously, we get these questions in advance, so I started to do some research myself. And what I found was Vienna, Austria, did some great job. And does a great job. And what they do, similar to what Laura mentioned, is engagement. They started to really engage both men and women and index that information, but specifically around transit. And what they saw was that the needs of men and women were different. Um, and how they operated through transit was very different. And what they decided to do was really look at how some of their policies and procedures would deal with that. And they looked at park design, they looked at some of residential redevelopment pieces and how that would play into it. So residential pieces, they would have multiple uses on site because what they decide or what they discovered is that women do more multiple trips, mainly related to children, and how would they have that access to do it so that they had time to actually spend with their family. Also, what was very interesting about that too is that it was coming from the municipal level. So what's interesting to see is that can also come from, applicants coming in, be it developers, be it transportation consultants and whatnot, having that ability to kind of push the city to kind of push those initiatives. And I think the way they describe this kind of movement is around gender mainstreaming and making sure that policies, processes, council approvals work around that.
Gender mainstreaming. Yeah, I'm happy you brought up that term. We've been seeing a lot of that research. We've done a lot of research into gender mainstreaming, and more municipal governments putting that gender lens over policies that they're developing. So thank you so much for that example. Beth, your turn. You're up next. So, and like I said earlier, you can use either social or physical infrastructure.
I'm going to use both. I'm going to opt for both. So I was sort of chuckling because, part one to the question is there a government that does a better job? And in my brain, I'm going, I'm not a researcher. This would be a really good question for a researcher. And then I love how Lorelai and Rachel are like little researchers. So I'm going to focus on how could government do a better job? And I think it's about having governments that represent the people they serve. So like gender-wise, racial-wise, like all those different intersections, that is a thing. But when we're imagining building or rebuilding infrastructure, the fundamental question we should be asking is, what is its purpose? And its purpose should be both about the social and the physical. So one of the models that I use when I'm thinking about cities is we use the language, I'm in Edmonton and we talk about city building all the time. City building is only half of the equation. It's what are we going to build and how do we regulate it and what money are we going to spend on it, which honestly is a very masculine way of thinking. It's physical. It's on the outside and it's physical. But Lorelai's asking us to think about the social, so if we're building, how are we building care into what we build? And the way I look at it is if you put both of those things together, that you've got something physical that works and it actually cares for people and their needs and the diversity of needs, then we're making a place. So then we get into city making as opposed to city building, and it needs care to come along with it. And I think in that question around, so what is the purpose of the infrastructure? It needs to serve multiple purposes. So who are all of the users that we imagine are going to use it and what are their needs? ask those questions, listen to the answers, ask those questions of the right people, and then just because we understand something, then the next question is, so what are we going to do about it? So there has to be a follow-up to actually do something with what we know and understand differently. So it's not even sufficient to ask the question, like, do we understand? Does the city understand what it needs to do? I don't care if they understand. I care if they understand and they're going to do something about it.
Yeah, I think you bring up two good points there. One being outcome. We tend to focus, I think, taxes, no taxes, that is a popular conversation. We tend to focus on those things more than we ask the question, what outcomes are we looking for?